Good afternoon, everybody. Well done for resisting the temptation to go and get a cup of tea at this stage in the proceedings. We will try to make it worth your while staying by talking about really urgent and interesting issues, but also linking them to the previous sessions and the previous discussions. So we're talking about the climate transition, and there are, of course, elements of that which very much relate to issues about competitiveness and about the economic future of Europe. They are also issues to do with the social fabric of European societies and the way that both the physical impact of climate is already starting to tear at the social fabric when we see wildfires and floods and droughts and so on. And of course, there are a lot of issues to do with technology. AI definitely is not going to get us out of the climate crisis, but it has an impact for sure on the way that we talk about it and also in thinking about what kinds of solutions we can come up with. So I'm very glad that we have a really excellent panel to discuss both the socio-economic effects of the climate transition, but also how we do it, how we actually make the climate transition happen. So we have on the screen Yamid Danier, Open Society Foundations in Washington, D.C., and she was previously at the World Resources Institute. So resources is an issue that often gets forgotten and kept in the shadow in comparison with, say, carbon emissions and the energy transition. So I just flag that to you, because if you want to think about asking some questions about resources, now is your opportunity. But I'm going to start here in the room. We'll come to Yamid in a moment, with Valérie Trouet, who's the scientific director of the Belgian Climate Centre. And Valérie, you have done a lot of work both on how to make the transition happen and also the kind of impact that we can expect it to have on societies. And in terms of presenting the science of climate in the public, we know that only certain scientific facts get taken up. There are a lot which get phased out, and particularly because the human brain can only cope with so much reality, as T.S. Eliot put it. Humankind can only cope with so much reality, and sometimes the very bad news that comes on climate is just too much for people to accept. So it's, if you wake up in the morning and you hear the radio telling you yet another dire forecast about breaching 1.5 degrees and the implications that that has, it's so much easier just to start thinking about breakfast. So how do we get beyond that? And in an interview with KU Leuven, Valérie, I know you said a couple of years ago, climate science isn't always about breaking the bad news. So what kind of news should be debated a great deal more? What parts of the climate science and being at the cutting edge of it really needs to be out in the political debate about managing the transition, and particularly in ensuring that the public is making informed choices when it comes to elections?
Yes, thank you very much for the invite to be here, and thank you, Heather, for the question. I think there is a lot of bad news. We're not going to hide that that's the case when it comes to climate science. But I think one aspect that is underemphasized is that the solution to curbing climate change is reducing our fossil fuel use, right? The other benefits that come with doing exactly that, with changing from fossil fuels to renewable energy, the enormous benefits other than, saving the climate, the health benefits that come from that, the air quality improvement, the geopolitical stability, the opportunity for countries that are lagging in terms of development to take a lead. Countries like in desert environments where they can produce massive amount of solar energy. The opportunities to change the geopolitical situation. I think that's underemphasized. The benefits, the additional benefits that moving away from fossil fuels, the society we're moving towards, and this transition has started, right? This is not something that we need to do in the future. It has started, whether we like it or not. I think that's another thing that a lot of people in the broader population are not aware of. This has started and it's not going to turn around. So the Paris Agreement of 2015 has made it clear that this is the direction we're moving towards. And so you can fight it, but that's going to be in your own disadvantage, very much so.
So getting people simply to accept the reality that the climate transition is inevitable is also part of the...
I think that is very much, there's a counter side to that as well, of course, that the transition is inevitable, but also climate change is inevitable and irreversible. What we are, the climate as we are producing it now, we're in completely uncharted territory. We should not be optimists about that, right? We're at 422 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. We haven't seen that in at least 1.2 million years, right? Since long before humanity even existed, we haven't seen this amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And so that gives us scientists a big disadvantage because we're constantly catching up. We have no model of what is coming because it's never happened before, at least not in the existence of humanity. I'm sorry, I don't know where I was going with this. I'll be very honest.
Absolutely super. That's exactly the kind of thing that people need to hear on the radio first thing in the morning to understand what's going on. So Thomas Bellerin-Carlin, who's at the Institute for Climate Economics in Paris, is there in fact too much good news? You work on clean tech, and all the time we're being told, oh, fantastic clean tech opportunities, means we can do manufacturing in the United States and in Europe again. It's going to save both moderate politics and lots of jobs because there won't be loss of jobs from the climate transition. Is this really true?
So, I'll be happy to talk more about clean tech, and indeed clean tech is a massive opportunity for us Europeans. And even had it not been for climate change, even if climate change did not exist, which obviously it does, it would still be in our interest, both economically and geopolitically, to go for those clean solutions. For decades, the mainstream debate in Brussels, but also in national capitals, was, oh, yeah, sure, climate is important, we listen to the scientists, but can we afford the transition economically? And to me, and that's the way we look at it as the Institute for Climate Economics, the real question is, can we afford to remain dependent on fossil fuels? And especially on fossil gas. And that's critical for the cost competitiveness, which is one part of competitiveness of the European industry. For years and years and years, you who are in Brussels or in Berlin, you've been hearing fossil gas lobbyists telling you, and also some energy-intensive industry telling you that the cost of gas in Europe was very expensive because it was more expensive than in the US. And they were right. What they forgot to tell often was that the cost of gas in Europe was cheaper than in China or in Japan. And why is that? Because in Asia, China and Japan always relied on liquefied natural gas since the 1970s, the most expensive kind of gas.
Because it's shipped in rather than piped.
Absolutely. And so the price there was about $6 per MBTU, which is a British unit we use for gas. On the other side of the Atlantic, in the US, with a lot of public funding, they developed shale gas. And they got very, very cheap gas, around $2. So $6 in Japan and China, $2 in the US. And in Europe, we were at the middle, $4. Yes, we were importing a bit of LNG, for instance, in the port of Zeebrugge, not far from Brussels. We were also having some gas production in Romania, in the Netherlands, in Norway. We have less and less of that. But obviously, elephant in the room, we were accepting and buying relatively cheap gas from Vladimir Putin's Russia. And from the year 2000 to the year 2014, this was largely not debated. From 2014 to 2021, this pact continued. Obviously, there was a moral cost to that because 2014 was the beginning of the war that Putin wages on Ukraine and has been waging for 8 years now, 9 even now. And there were disagreements among us as Europeans. And de facto, the coalition that won was the coalition of let's keep the cheap gas. That's the Nord Stream coalition. with obviously people like Angela Merkel, but also the president of France, François Hollande, also supported that, as did Emmanuel Macron. The Netherlands also supported that approach that was obviously not the one favored by the Commission, by Poland, or by Estonia. But this changed in 2021 when Russian gas supplies to Europe started to decrease. Not as a result of our choice, as a result of Russia's choice. And so the first cut happened in the summer of 2021, and then a second big cut happened in April 2022 after the Russian defeat near Kiev. And what we saw on the gas market was the disappearance of the European gas price. It was just going at the Asian level and sometimes even more expensive. So what's going to happen for the next decades? You can, for those of you working in foresight, you can make very unrealistic scenarios where for some reason, some miracle happen or some disaster happen, and for whatever reason we, again, have cheap gas coming from Russia to Europe, and then you can say, yeah, let's start like, 2008 was so great. But this is extremely unlikely. Until for the next 2 or 3 decades, we have to live in a world, we will, not because of our choosing, live in a world of very expensive fossil gas. And the gas in China will become cheaper because of the pact between President Xi and Vladimir Putin to get cheap Russian gas from Russia to China. They are installing the pipelines as we speak. So can we afford the luxury of remaining dependent on fossil fuel, especially on fossil gas? To me, I see no scenario of industrial cost competitiveness as long as we remain dependent on gas, because I see no scenario where gas prices in Europe will be cheaper than Chinese prices or American prices, so we need to find a way out.
And so the economic opportunities have been forced upon us rather than chosen by us. Are you optimistic that we're actually taking them up well? Because we're subsidizing fossil fuels at an enormous rate right now.
Absolutely. So your colleagues at Bruegel crushed the numbers. Sometimes when we talk about climate investments, some people are saying, well, it's very costly, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, hey, remember the cost of fossil fuel subsidies. Fossil fuel subsidies, back in the good old days of the 2010 decade, were costing 50 billion euros per year to the member states. So that's around the common agricultural policy, to give you a point of comparison. And then 2021 hit, and we had the increase of gas prices and oil prices. And as a result of that, member states started what is likely to be the biggest fossil fuel subsidy spending spree in European history, with a total number that, according to Bruegel, is 600 billion euros. 600 billion euros of subsidies to keep the status quo, to make sure that we can afford to be reliant on fossil fuels for the coming years. What makes me, however, hopeful is that when you look at the changes in clean tech, the efficiency of electrolyzers, the efficiency of heat pumps, the technological progress in batteries, the very cheap cost of solar panels and of wind power, to me, at some point, I'm even wondering whether currently public funding is actually not acting against the transition. And if we look at the numbers, for sure, for 2021 and 2022, there is more public money going to fossil fuels than public money going to the green transition.
Yeah, which is really shocking when you think about what's happened with the war and the scale of the paradigm shift, the Zeitenwende that we have made on this. So this is a European issue, very much so, but it's also a global issue. And Jean Pisani-Ferry was this morning pointing out, when he was discussing the overall economic impact of the climate transition, his estimate that it's 2% of GDP globally for the next 20 years. And we had a number of comments from the audience about, yes, and what about the costs of not doing it, which will be a good deal higher. And yet we are relying on, globally, a rather small governance structure to think about working together on this. And Yami Danier, who's joining us from Washington, knows this structure very well. She's been at many COPs in the past, and she'll be going to COP28. And she's been a diplomat there as well as an NGO person there. So Yamid, how can we get serious multilateral international governance of the climate transition. The COP was set up specifically to look at emissions, and then there are much wider issues to do with forests and biodiversity and so on, which it now touches on a little bit, but there's been now the Montreal Summit on biodiversity. But there's nothing binding. Every decision at COP is subject to unanimity, and then it's up to each country to implement its targets. Are you hopeful that there could be a different kind of more effective multilateral governance of this transition?
Well, thank you, Heather, for these tough questions. And, my response, to this is a little bit complex. We know that this COP 28 in the Emirates, which means in a petro state, is going to be really tough in the backdrop of all the polycrises that we know, and including the war raging in the region. It will test the Paris Agreement through its accountability mechanism, the one called the Global Stocktake, that is supposed to look at how collectively we're doing towards the Paris goals, both on mitigation, on how to keep 1.5 alive, and also on the resilience goal and on the financial goal, which is on how we're aligning financial flows to meet the Paris Agreement. So it will be a test for multilateralism. And what worries me is that a key ingredient for success is trust and good faith among countries. And yet that trust has been broken. Too much of double standards, especially from the North, too many promises unfulfilled, including from the North, especially from the North on finance in particular, some backsliding, and many would say hypocrisy, a backsliding, and I think Thomas alluded to that a little bit when it comes to the investment, in fossil fuel, in investment on climate. ODA has retracted in many countries, European countries, in the UK. And as a result, we see a weakening of progressive North-South coalitions, which were already seen a little bit transactional, too transactional, but now what we see is, more South-South unity, and this has been demonstrated during the last negotiations of the Transition Committee on Loss and Damage. And we see also more proactive proposals, from countries, vulnerable countries like Barbados, the V20, which is now 68 countries deemed the most vulnerable countries, on how to reshape the financial system. So it's not just about reducing emissions, it's about changing also the structural processes that have led cooperation, and that are actually shaping still the financial flows north-south, south-north, that is being put into question. So building that trust, is going to be very important, and for that you need to renew a sense of global solidarity. So on top of what Valerie and Thomas said, which I totally agree with, I think the notion of solidarity that leaves no one behind. For many in the world, there's a sentiment that there's solidarity for just a few countries. That I think that signal, is going to be important. And I am a little bit hopeful, since the EU yesterday has committed to make a significant pledge for the Loss and Damage Fund. Which took 3 decades, to come in. This loss and damage fund to really deal with those climate impact that cannot be adapted, towards. But I think the seriousness of this pledge is going to be judged not only on its scale, on the speed of access and the conditionalities or strings attached to it. And I think there's momentum for a target to triple renewable energy. But again, for this, we will need to look at how to make it just. What will be more complicated is languages at the COP on how to phase out fossil fuel. And I think, Thomas alluded to it. The real problem is that we've seen a doubling of investment, globally on fossil fuel, not just Europe. So we are really going into the wrong direction. And this COP28, with this global stocktake, again, a collective mechanism set up under the Paris Agreement to see how we course correct, is going to be also a litmus test, for multilateralism broadly speaking.
Thank you. That's a really interesting outlook on what COP could bring and might not bring. And Yamid has also raised a very important issue as regards the socio-economic dynamics of the transition, which is that there's a very profound unfairness that the Global South, which has, broadly speaking, it's very difficult to use, you've got to find the right terms to describe this, but the countries which have contributed least to the parts per million of carbon emissions in the atmosphere are often the ones being hit the worst by the impact of climate. So there's the historical injustice. And of course, there's the injustice of carbon emissions per capita, which, are the average American is emitting 7 times what the average Indian is emitting per year, for example. So there's some very profound justice issues here. But I wonder if we could perhaps go into perhaps one of the most difficult issues at the moment for Europe. Yamid was pointing out the EU is willing to contribute financially. It's putting in something into the loss and damage fund. The EU is voting for climate finance in the multilateral development banks and in its own development aid through the international partnerships. But when you look at the politics of the climate transition in Europe, of course, the priority that politicians get their attention drawn to all the time is the left behinds in Europe, not the left behinds in the rest of the world. And there's a trade-off here. Are you going to spend public finance mainly on, for example, the coal miners in Europe who will lose their jobs because coal is phased out, or the coal miners in South Africa, or the coal miners in India? This is a very difficult thing to navigate, this just transition, which has different dimensions of justice. And I wonder what thoughts you have on how we manage this, because the transition has got to be just for people to believe in it and to buy it. It's got to be just both internationally and domestically. But how do we cope with that?
Well, I'm a scientist and not a policymaker, so I do have some thoughts. But they're more general. I'll let Thomas address the question more specifically. I think in addition to the justice part of it, there's also the part of how much do we spend on mitigation versus how much do we spend on adaptation, right? Mitigation is a global effort. Unless everyone mitigates, there's no point. I come from a small country, Belgium. This is the argument you hear made all the time. Why should we be doing this when the US and China continue to emit? Whereas adaptation can happen on a very local scale. Like adaptation has to happen on a very local scale. In Belgium we have too much water in winter. You have to make your rivers more meandering. You have to create more wetlands and so forth. So there's much more willingness to invest in adaptation than there is in mitigation because it's something you can do locally. I think from a scientific point of view, one very important component there is the 1.5 degrees and the 2 degrees. It might come as a shock, but 1.5, it's not going to happen. Scientifically speaking, it's impossible. No scientist is talking about 1.5 degrees anymore because it's not going to happen. So we're aiming for 2 degrees. We'll be lucky if we can cap it at 2 degrees. That's what we should be aiming for. Now that 2 degree, and again, it's important to know we are working with a moving target, right? A moving target, uncharted territory, so nothing that even we scientists say in terms of what's going to happen in the future is set in stone. And the most important component of why it's hard for us to predict whether or not we're going to be able to cap it at those 2 degrees is not because we don't understand the climate well enough. It's not because we don't understand the greenhouse gas effect well enough. It's not because any of that. It's because we don't understand people well enough. The uncertainty of where we're going to end up in this climate and all of these climate models, the uncertainty is in how society, how the global society is going to react, whether we're going to get our act together in time or not. That's where the uncertainty comes from. That's where We don't know what the future is going to bring in terms of climate. It's not because we don't understand the climate well enough. That was one point. The other point I wanted to make is, in addition to conflict between those historical emitters and non-emitters, is intergenerational conflict, right? A person who is 70 years old today has will experience 4 to 7 times fewer heat waves in their lifetime than a person who is born today. The effect of these climate extremes on generations that are born now and that will be born in the coming years is much more impactful than on those generations who have historically benefited from those fossil fuels emissions. So it's not only a geographical conflict, it's also an intergenerational conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. Thomas, you might well have some thoughts on this, but I also wanted to ask you about the whole concept of competitiveness. We've heard a lot about that this morning, a great deal of discussion about how can Europe remain competitive vis-a-vis the US and China. But when it comes to the climate transition, is economic competitiveness, does it need to be redefined? Because this does need to be a common endeavor. Essentially, does it matter whether the clean tech results in profits to companies in China, the US, or in Europe? Isn't it more important that there is just as much clean tech available to as many countries as possible so that everybody can decarbonize? As Valérie was just pointing out, the atmosphere doesn't care where the carbon emissions come from. Nobody benefits if carbon emissions are cut in one place, but they remain the same or go up in another. So do we need to redefine it, or do we just need to think about clean tech as an industry that needs strategic investment everywhere?
Before that, I just want to maybe add a complementary point. So Valérie said that 1.5 Celsius degree warming is not something that we can reach anymore. Can you maybe just raise your arm? Just let me know, have you read one executive summary of the IPCC at some point in your life? Please raise your arm if you did. So that's kind of half of the room. So for the others, 1.5 degree may not seem that much. Who cares whether it's 13 or 14.5? Try to think of it as a fever, as human beings. So let's say my body is like 37.5 Celsius degree. If I'm at 1.5, my body's already at 39 Celsius degree. I can still live with that. I can maybe even work, but I don't feel great. Now we're going for 2 degrees. Best case scenario, 39.5. But the trend, like if the US does not elect Donald J. Trump and the US goes to climate neutrality by 2050, then we are at 2.5 or 2.7 Celsius degree. Using my fever metaphor again, that's 40 Celsius degree for a human body. And so you see that a few degrees actually matter. We've all experienced fever at some point in our life, so we know that a few degrees matter. And the second thing that we know is that it's not linear. A 2 degree warming is not twice worse than a 1 degree warming, just like a 40 Celsius degree fever is not twice worse than a 39 Celsius degree fever. And so to me, that's really one point. And another thing I wanted to add on this, it's not like we could not have reached 1.5 Celsius degree warming. Is that, frankly, other generations chose not to. Climate science is extremely old. Among the climate scientific articles that I've read, one was saying that if you double the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, you have, at least the estimate at the time, was an average increase of 4 Celsius degree. So a 4 Celsius degree global warming, we would say today. That paper was published by Svante Arrhenius, who later won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry, so he was not a weird guy. He was very renowned. And that paper was published in 1898. Late 19th century, just for snow.
The scientist who discovered the greenhouse gas effect was a woman, by the way, a British woman, in the 1850s, before the Industrial Revolution had even started. We knew the effect of increase in CO2 on temperature of the Earth.
So that's decades before Downton Abbey, just to put that in in pop culture perspective. Answering the question on competitiveness here, I'm looking at that from a European angle. Obviously, from a climate perspective, when you switch from gas to heat pump, whether the heat pump came from the US, China, Czechia, whatever, don't care. But obviously, when it comes to policy making, what is the policy you're trying to co-construct with member states, with private sector, with citizens? Currently, we live on an energy system that takes money out of the pocket of Europeans to give it to fossil fuel producers, some of them being actually European companies, but most of them being, those nice people in the Kremlin or in Saudi Arabia or in Iran that transformed, or in Qatar, by the way, that transformed that money into, I don't know, shells to hit the Ukrainians, money for Hamas, all those nice things. If we were to switch, well, we are switching actually, but if we were to increase the speed of the switch from oil and gas to renewable electricity with wind power, solar power, heat pumps, electrolyzers, batteries, we're certain we're going to win. Just because we are well placed in some of the sectors, the question is how can we maximize that win in order to realize that it's not only in our climate interest, that it is also in our economic interest, because it will create profit for private companies in Europe who are going to pay taxes at some point. It will also create quality jobs. One of the perks of a gigafactory, so a gigafactory, think like 200 hectares, one massive factory, only 2,000 people working there, so a lot of machines. And so the jobs that are created here have a great capacity to be extremely well paid, unionized, long-term job. And that's something that is not central yet in the European Commission approach to the transition, but it is central to the US approach to the transition. And my dear European friends, one thing we must learn from what happened in the USA, and we should stop being in a state of denial about that, is the long-term impact of the US Inflation Reduction Act. The US Inflation Reduction Act is brilliant, economically, politically, and also from a climate perspective, given the constraints that exist in the US political system. It's a long-term climate investment plan that gives the private sector a 10-year horizon, and the quantity of money, of public money available, is anything between 400 and 1,200, so $1.2 trillion. By contrast, in Europe, I've heard that we still bicker around STEP, which is a 5 billion euro top-up that we may or may not, in the end, decide to implement. So one thing we can learn about the US is what they're doing is currently the missing piece of the Green Deal. Of course, in Europe, we've got much better carbon pricing than the US, no question asked. We've got much better regulation. But our public investment offer is much weaker. It lacks quantity, and maybe even more importantly, it lacks quality. Because we don't have one federal level 10-year plan. We've got a small REPowerEU with a very short-term horizon, like 2026 is like today from a clean tech perspective. And then we've got a fragmentation of national schemes, all of them being different. So what I hope we can build, and it's a good idea to think of that also as a priority, or at least as a possible priority for the next mandate of the Commission, can climate investment become the next chapter of the European Green Deal? And if yes, what would it look like? If we were to build as European, with member states, with the private sector, with regions, if we were to build a European long-term climate investment plan from 2025 to 2035, how would it look like? And then obviously there would be a lot of political questions. Who pays for that? New debt or not? Solidarity between member states. Of course, all those questions are extremely relevant, but first we need to have a serious discussion. Currently, we're not having that, and I really see us missing the train. And I really fear that currently we are doing the same mistakes in 2023 that we did in 2003 on digital tech, where we did far too little, far too late, and essentially our choice is to either rely on American or Chinese tech, which obviously is a problem, as we've actually just talked before when it comes to regulated AI. So let's learn from our mistakes that we did on tech, and not repeat them on clean tech. Let's learn from the Inflation Reduction Act because it has a lot of great features. And obviously, let's do for Europeans what is good to be done for Europeans in the year 2024.
Thanks very much. I'm going to come to questions in just a moment, so start preparing what you'd like to ask. But I just want to go to Yamid for one other key point, which is, given your vast experience in climate diplomacy and thinking about how this goes forward, how is the Inflation Reduction Act seen by the rest of the world? In the United States, it's had this very strong political impact. It may well end up sustaining climate action, even if there's a radical change of president and approach to climate, which is quite remarkable. To be able to seed jobs in particular political constituencies is a power that we don't have in Europe, but it's something that could be very important to the political economy of the transition in the US. But it's something that other countries can't afford to do. Even in Europe, we have trouble because we don't have a common budget of more than 1% of GDP. But in the rest of the world, there's no way anybody has the fiscal headroom to do this. So, Yamid, how will the IRA overshadow the COP negotiations? Is there a sense that the United States is subsidizing to benefit itself, or is there a sense that this is actually a global public good, that the US is actually taking climate action?
Well, I think the RA is going to continue to create a little bit of hope that action is actually possible and mobilizing to be bipartisan as well. And I think there's a lot of lessons learned when it comes to the communication, the fact that it's not called a climate act, it's called and it's really touch the economic and social dimension that resonates with the people. So there's a communication lesson, but there's also implication for the rest of the world. This array, this bill, together with also the European Green Deal, are now looked at by the global South a little bit more, with scrutiny to look at the implication when it comes to trade, on their economy and what does it mean for the value chain. And I'm going to give you just an example, for the array and the amazing potential for renewable energy, for infrastructure, for electric vehicles. Well, that would require a substantive amount of critical minerals, which means a different ways to cooperate with also the global south, where most of those rare critical minerals would be. And in doing so, we need to make sure that we do not reproduce, the same stigma, the same curse that we've seen in oil and gas, the dashed gas, or we do address some of the issues with the mining industry as well, so that we do not create deforestation, for the sake of collecting, more critical minerals. We do look at, labor. We do look at, what this means for frontline communities that will be affected, by the supply chain. And more importantly, I think the word that is missing, building on what Valerie and Thomas said, is this notion of shared prosperity. That what is going to happen, and of course, Europe and the US will need to see how it benefits for their own population. But it's the possibility to have a win-win and to have a shared prosperity with the rest of the world that is also looking at moving away from extractivism. That, for example, they're not going to be just the place where critical minerals are going to be extracted, and then all the manufacturing is going to happen in Europe or in the US. There's going to be a lot of repercussions, and we see that even on trade deals. Look at the ban that Indonesia put forward to actually trigger more technology transfer, to access to its nickel, and China has responded to this. So I think when it comes to this just transition, it's not just Europe, it's not just the US. It does have consequences on on, everybody, the world is interconnected, but you need to look at the whole value chain and really challenge, the notion of shared prosperity. There's too much fear and scarcity narrative that have translated, into, the possibility that we do have to really get that transition forward. And I think we need to change that. And I'm going to give you just one additional example about this notion of shared prosperity and global solidarity, bringing the issue of finance again a little bit. Because this is important, for Europe to think, yes, it needs to invest into its society, but investing also abroad can be for the benefit of its society. In 1953, after the World War, uh, Germany had, a substantive, significant debt, and that debt was cancelled with the support of many developing countries. This is a story that we don't see in the news very, very often. But if it was not for the solidarity, including from the global South, Germany would not be where it is today. And I think we need to really change, how the world, the Europeans, Americans can benefit, by, a greater solidarity among people and for shared benefits, and shared prosperity across, the globe.
Thank you very much, Yamid. So now we will come to all of your questions, starting here at the back.
Good afternoon. My name is Servaas Dutelo from TU Delft in the Netherlands. And my question is about the global climate trends. And you described very nicely the temperature rise that people face. And eventually, if it takes long enough, people just drop dead. That is if you have 50 Celsius for a month in a city or 55 Celsius, that will happen. Last summer, that was the case in Rome and in parts of Athens, but also worldwide. Now, what is missing at the moment in the European research and innovation agenda is any plan on whether we should investigate, not implement, only investigate technologies for climate geoengineering, just as a backup. The White House has done so. I think China has done so. And we are dragging our feet. Either we follow or lead or arrange a place at the table in terms of strategic autonomy. And I would like the panel to respond on that, please. Thank you.
Okay, geoengineering. This is a big category.
I'm happy to respond. I think more so than research. And so for those who don't know what geoengineering, what we're referring to, I mean, there's multiple definitions depending on whom you ask. So I think there's the carbon capture and storage, carbon direct air capture, that kind of geoengineering. I think there's already a lot of research happening on it. It's fairly innocent in the realm of geoengineering. Other options that are being offered are being thought about are, for instance, the mimicking of volcanic eruptions. So spewing sulfates and aerosols into the upper layers of the atmosphere to mimic the effect of volcanic eruption. If you put aerosols in the upper atmosphere, the sunlight, rather than coming in, it gets reflected back. That's what happens after a big volcanic eruption. It lasts a couple of years. So the idea is, if we can do that, you fly airplanes, but you would have to continuously fly airplanes into the upper regions of the atmosphere to continuously spew aerosols. To do that effect, you could slow down climate change, or you couldn't actually slow it down. You could stop the effect of CO2 emissions, and the idea is, in general, that we would save ourselves a bit more time by doing so. There's a lot to be said about, that's the cheapest option. And it's actually remarkably cheap. The cheapest option in terms of geoengineering. There's other things like putting mirrors on satellites and all of that, but that's much more expensive. It's actually so cheap that a private company could do it. Any country could do it. If Elon Musk tomorrow decides that this is he wants to do, he can do that. And there is no international legislation about geoengineering whatsoever. So before anyone starts doing research on this, what we do need urgently is international legislation around it. Secondly, it's extremely dangerous because it's an illusion to think that by doing that, the only thing you will stop is the warming, right? I mean, it's not the greenhouse gas effect. The Earth warms up, and it's an illusion to think that the only thing that's happening is that it's getting warmer. Your rainfall patterns are changing dramatically. It's getting your winters are getting wetter, your summers are getting drier. We don't understand well enough what the effect of these volcanic eruptions are, how they influence rainfall patterns across the world. It's an extremely dangerous weapon, like, because anyone can do it, but it's not like, there's weather, sorry, I'm going to backtrack for 1 second. There's weather engineering, and that's already happening. You can shoot silver particles into a cloud to make that cloud rain. And that happens on a very local basis, and that's already happening in China. In the US, they do this, right? And that's very local. You're not threatening anyone else with that unless you create a flood. Or again, it's a fairly innocent thing to do because it's very local. This idea of mimicking volcanoes, you cannot do it locally. It's either the entire Earth or nowhere. Right? You need the entire atmosphere, and the atmosphere is not something that you can address locally. Those sulfates are gonna go around the entire atmosphere, or it's not gonna work. And so we know and this is actually from my own research, I'm a paleoclimatologist, I study the climate of the past. We know from studying the effect of volcanic eruptions in the past that your ITCZ, your intertropical convergence zone broadens, which creates deserts in certain areas, and it makes, for instance, the southeast of the US much wetter than normal. So you are creating these you are at risk of creating international differences. Again, if the US decides to do this, they can make it drier in China by doing this, right? And so, sorry. And the last thing that I want to say is, yes, you can cool down the Earth for X number of years by doing that. And again, this is like, someone in the previous session was saying with the COVID vaccines, good thing we would never have done that without clinical trials. So would we be doing this without clinical trials? Geoengineering? When we're talking about uncharted territory, talk about uncharted territory, right? Last thing I want to say is it doesn't address anything in terms of carbon dioxide. It doesn't address ocean acidification. It doesn't address, the moment you stop doing it, the moment you run out of money, all of that heat is there just like that.
Right.
I'd like to
But
no,
I only asked whether research would be good to do.
well,
Research,
you
not
answered that.
implementing research.
okay, thank you.
Fair enough. I think
I-
research should happen. Yes. That was.
But,
Sorry, did
but
I not
you
say
also
that?
said, but please let's have a global governance framework for that research, right?
More important than research, we need legislation about.
Yeah.
I think
We need a
that was
governance
my
framework
answer.
of
That's where I was
some
getting
kind.
at. Thank you for
And-
getting me to the point.
And just to relate this back to some of the earlier discussions about weaponization of this and that, I mean, the fact that you can cause, even now, differential rainfall patterns somewhere else in your region, this technology could be weaponized. Imagine if China wished to visit a flood or a drought upon Taiwan. This is something which, would that be an act of war? Is that something that the US would retaliate to? It raises all kinds of issues about sovereignty and lack of sovereignty, in fact, which we don't have any way of thinking about at the moment. So, Yamid, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I think, and thanks, Valerie, for going through, the details about the implication. I just wanted to bring those 3Ds, 3D, 3Ds, minus 1D, that needs to be, to take this forward. For me, first, we need to democratize these issues. For too long, this issue of geoengineering, but, other technologies, everything that Valerie had alluded to has been discussed by a niche of, by an elite, and mainly in the north. And I think it's going to be very important to make sure that the research also does not happen just in the north, that it happens also with, southerners. Otherwise there's going to be, more, conflict, and we've seen, the ban by some countries, and I think it needs to really be democratized. So this is the first D. Then it needs to be also demystified, and which means that we need to create some spaces to unpack, what it is, really, and to communicate, clearly about this. The third D is de-risk, because as Valerie said, there's so many unknown. There's so many risks. We need to create the right safeguards, the right guardrails, to set up an international governance, with the right legislations. And the minus 1D is, the minus distraction, because as Valerie said, we need to make sure that everything else, that if we don't do what, science taught us to do, including getting rid of our dependence to fossil fuel, doing still more, on resilient, we're just going to play catch up, a never end catch up. It's not necessarily going to deal with, to be the answer. And unless we do all those 3Ds that I mentioned, plus, avoid distraction and maintain efforts, on what the IPCC made it clear, we're going to really, struggle to create the safe, with the human right approach and just, kind of transition that we aim to do.
Super, thank you. Thomas.
Yeah. I want to end with a wider point on the importance of technology in the transition. So decades of procrastination led us to geoengineering being even something that we sadly now have to debate, because, as you said, people like Elon Musk just choose and do it. What strikes me is that we've got all the technologies we need to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 90% if you want to be conservative, 95% very easily. And the way to do this will be more or less difficult, but once you're there, you're actually in a better place. This very morning I was talking to a former colleague of mine from the College of Europe. She was telling me about a baby boy, or girl, actually I don't even know, who is constantly sick because of air pollution in Brussels. Bronchiolitis, which is one disease that kids have. If you get rid of air pollution, you actually improve the health of everyone, which is also part of the just transition. What do you need to do that? A ton of things to do. Reduce the number of cars in Brussels would be a great idea, as in big cities. But if you just switch from a petrol car to an electric car, it's actually cheaper. It's more expensive to buy, but it's cheaper to use. I went back home in Normandy. I'm from rural Normandy originally. Went back home from Paris to rural Normandy to see my dad. With my girlfriend, we rented an electric car. Very comfortable. We could actually listen to podcasts without being disturbed by the noise of the engine. Very comfortable ride. How much did it cost us to just fuel the tank? Rather than pay 100 euros, we'd pay maybe 20 euros to fuel the tank with electricity. It is actually cheaper. If you actually buy an electric car, you will pretty much never go to the garage, because the electric engine is so reliable, much more reliable than the internal combustion engine. It's essentially a washing machine engine, just bigger, and it's extremely reliable. Same goes for heat pumps. Building renovation. A student of mine at Sciences Po, I was doing like 2-hour course on the building renovation wave, and she said, yeah, actually, Professor, I remember for 2 years I was living in that place in Germany. I never started the heater ever, just because the place was so well insulated that you don't even need to heat the place in Berlin winter. Just the heat that is produced by cooking is enough to heat the place. And so I'm like, I mean, I get your point on research and engineering, but like, what on earth? Why are we not implementing all the technologies that are there that reduce air pollution? It boils down to a political and a governance problem. A lot of things, a lot of a lot of big policies that we changed during this mandate. That includes carbon pricing, that includes regulation for electric cars. We need now to open a new chapter, and that's that long-term investment plan. Because if you want families to be able to renovate their homes, to install a heat pump or a solar thermal system, and to be able to use an electric vehicle, whatever kind of vehicle it is, you need to support them. And currently, that's the missing piece of the puzzle. If we get there, then hopefully we will be able to have Europe becoming the prototype of a successful, efficient, speedy, just transition. And obviously working with our international partners, because we don't want to do that transition only in Europe, but together with the US, with China, with Chile, with Namibia, with all the countries in the world. And then hopefully if we do that, in a few years, we will stop talking about geoengineering, just because we will no longer need to talk about it, because we'll have implemented all the technologies that are there and that can already save us all.
Thank you very much. Now, this is the main strategic foresight conference that happens every year in Brussels of all of the EU institutions. So you've got a huge range of people working on lots of different policies across all of the institutions. Next year and the following year, there will probably be another panel on climate. So what should it focus on? What is completely missing from the policy discussion that really matters from your point of view? Yamid, would you like to start? You can just give us a word, is fine. A word or two is, you know, should it be governance? Should it be the technology points? Should it be the climate diplomacy? Oh, we don't hear you, sorry. I think there's a problem with the sound.
Do you hear me now?
Yeah, we hear you now. Perfect. Go ahead.
Yes, I would say that, you know, what is required right now, you know, on the policy front, actually beyond even policy, is a free seats. You know, the capacity to be mobilized and to build, you know, that global transition in Europe, in US, you know, everywhere there needs to be a capacity investment. You know, the role of youth, you know, Valerie mentioned before that it's also an intergenerational, you know, issue. And there's many other stakeholders, you know, from the private sector, from the judge, there's a lot of capacity. You know, the second C is communication strategy. And I think, you know, you started this conversation, you know, on the communication side, including how to take into account, you know, the artificial intelligence, how to counter disinformation, but also bringing a little bit more of the notion of storytelling. Looking at, you know, the different narratives that would need to be done, you know, whether it's rural, urban, you know, in different places, you know, even within Europe, it's different narratives. And the third is consistency. Because this is a long-term investment, and we see the fossil fuel industry is probably in its second honeymoon, you know, right now, but it's also because of consistent and long-term investment. So I think that, you know, yes, capacity, communication, consistency would be absolutely important to support the policies that we want to see implemented.
Thank you, Yamid. So, what is missing?
I'd like to say two things. One, this is a conference of the future. Let's think about the long future, right? The carbon dioxide effect, the greenhouse gas effect is such is that whatever we put into the atmosphere now, the 422 ppm that we're at now, we're still going to be at that 1,000 years from now. Like when we're talking about the future, we're talking about 1,000 years from now. What we are doing these next 10 years will influence the climate 1,000 years from now. So that should be the kind of the margins that we're thinking about. Let's think about that. Let's have that be the theme of next year's. And then in 2 years, and how many years do we have? And then in 2 years, I think Thomas was referring to the IPCC report. The conclusion of the latest IPCC report was crystal clear. To address this climate change issue, we have all the technology that we need. We don't need geoengineering. We have all the technology we need. We have all the knowledge we need. And we have all the capital we need. Why we are not doing it is because we lack societal will. And so how do we address the societal will? And there's a whole branch of science now. There's a motivational psychologist, motivational scientists who study this. But it's new, of course, because the whole thinking about climate change is fairly new, but there's a whole branch of science that is specialized in, and communication is a very important part of that. How do we create and enhance the societal will to address the problem, other than waiting for these calamities to occur?
Absolutely. Thomas, do you have a word?
Yeah, so for next year, so I assume we already have, by next year, a serious debate on the EU long-term climate investment plan. So assuming this is done, two things. One, to answer to me, it's not really a lack of societal demand; it's a lack of political demand, which is different. If you look at European polls, Eurobarometer, what's the top priority for Europeans when it comes to EU action? Number one is fighting poverty. Number two is public health. Number three is the environment. Judging from those polls, Europeans care twice more about the environment than they do about migration. But obviously, one topic is being more discussed by political parties, by and large, than others. One way we could test is the Citizen Convention on Climate Change at the EU level. We already have experience in Ireland, in Germany, in France, in Spain. That could be one way to kind of reveal what deliberative democracy can bring to the EU debate.
Great.
Last thing for civil servants, climate change adaptation. Just have a think. What could be a next MFF, a next EU multi-annual financial framework that really takes climate change seriously? It would be one when you're certain that each euro of public money that is spent on a project where we have considered the impact of climate change. And currently, this is not the case. If you consider this for everything from schools to water management to agriculture, that leads you to actually save a lot of money by doing something that is resilient by design.
Okay, so turning the CAP into the climate adaptation policy might be the goal. Thank you very much to our excellent panel.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Heather, Yamid is already there, Thomas and Valérie, for being here for the panel. Thank you. So now you have merited a coffee, and we have a 25 minutes break. But I would like you to look again at the QR code, because we have another question for you for your coffee discussions. And that is, in the light of global trends, which strategic choices should the EU make today? So, and have a look at, so please answer the question. We will look at the results and have a look at the drawings as well, and see you in 25 minutes. Thank you.